Thank you so much all for attending the 2020 Summer Nonprofit Policy Forum. I believe this is the first one we've ever had, at least since I've been here, due to not usually being in session, but we're really glad you could join us. My name is Hannah Young, and I'm the Public Policy Manager at Nonprofit Associations of Midlands. Just wanted to give you a little information before we get started. This will be recorded and sent out after the presentation has concluded. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can. Okay, I'm just here to give a short overview on the impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit sector as a whole. We have now done 2 pulse polls to gauge what the impact of COVID-19. Our first poll was done in the middle of March and received about 500 individual responses. We decided to do a second poll at the end of April to try and understand the continued impacts of COVID-19 in the last couple months. We do plan on doing at least one more poll, most likely opening up late summer, early fall, and then we will assess from there if we should do more. This is a reminder that some of you may or may not know, our previous economic impact report shows that 1 in 11 Nebraskans work for a nonprofit. So gauging the impact of COVID-19 on the sector was really important for us and our community. For the second pulse poll, which I'll be talking about here, we asked that it was only taken once per organization instead of individually, and we received 231 responses. As you can see, 97% said they had been impacted by COVID or expect to be impacted by COVID. 63% said that impact would be significant. 33% said it would be a moderate impact, and 3% was a low impact. And I want to reiterate that this again was done in April, so I'm sure this has changed since then. That's the latest data we have. One of the biggest changes we saw from March to April was an increase in nonprofits' concern about the economy and how it may impact their organization. This is critical when it comes to individual contributions and how nonprofits expect to budget in the upcoming months and years. The most shocking finding from our poll was out of the 231 who responded, they anticipate losing at least $42 million due to COVID-19. This is a very conservative estimate, given that it only comes from those who responded. 55% of nonprofits will have to either cancel or postpone their major events and/or fundraisers. This is incredibly concerning because a lot of dollars have already been spent on the events, and even more will be lost with the inability to host and raise these dollars. It'll also be interesting to see what major events start happening again, the difficulty of competing events and fundraisers, and how nonprofits will have to navigate that challenge. We are seeing nonprofits being creative in their fundraising asks with virtual fundraisers and programs. It is too soon to really know how effective they are, but we predict that they will not have the same monetary value as in-person fundraisers and events, but we will see. When asked about long-term financial implications, 39% said they are moderate and will need additional financial support. They will see some mild effects in the long term. 33% said the effects are moderate, but they don't see any long-term impacts. And 11% said their organization is in a crisis and does expect long-term effects on their operation. Again, this was as of the end of April, so when we do our next survey, I'll be really interested to see how that changes. Generalized impacts on the sector include 86% of organizations having to change or adjust their strategies. This could mean anything from having employees work from home, canceling or adjusting programs and services, or adjusting financially. 30% have seen a direct increase in their demand for services, and 19% have difficulty accessing technology that they desperately need to do their jobs. The CARES Act was helpful for a lot of nonprofit communities, specifically the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL loans, the Economic Injury Disaster loans. 68 of those surveyed applied for the PPP loan, and 12% applied for EIDL loans. Most nonprofits said their experience with those loans was pretty simple, but it came down to the financial institution they used. An overwhelming amount said they used local banks, and they believe that that was the driving force in the ability to get the loans before the dollars ran out. We have not surveyed yet on the reporting of the loans and loan forgiveness, so that will be something we will put in the next survey. In the next survey, we plan to ask how many of those nonprofits received those TPP funds, how many forgiven, and what experience overall they had with the loans. We'll also do a deeper dive into what funds nonprofits receive from the state of Nebraska, which we will talk about a little bit more in this presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to Renee Fry, the Executive Director of OpenSky Policy Institute. Thank you so much for being here, and we really value your expertise in this field.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much for hosting this. Thank you to you and to Ann Hendry. Ann Hendry is also on. She'll be joining us. She'll be participating a little bit in one of the slides that I have, actually. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. NAM actually went over, hit 100 in capacity really quickly for this webinar. So we ended up actually switching to a different Zoom platform, which we lose some functionality with doing that. We're using the webinar conference on Zoom. So unfortunately, there's not as much interaction as I really typically enjoy with these presentations that we do in partnership with NAM, where we're really able to engage with you in Q&A and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, we are going to lose some of that personal touch. But if you see at the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's that Q&A section. Hannah is going to, she's going to keep track of those questions for me. So if you have a question, please be sure at any time to put into that Q&A, type your question. And Hannah, feel free to interrupt me if it's relevant to a particular slide. I'm fine with that. I will try to stop in between sections and take questions if something came up. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But unfortunately, we lose some of that interaction with this format when you have a lot of people. So that's the downside of one of the downsides of not being face-to-face with all of you, but hopefully we can still answer all the questions that you have. So, and I think for anyone who joined late, I would just mention that Hannah mentioned that this is being recorded, and our slides, Hannah, I assume you'll send your slides as well, but our slides will be available for anyone that registered as well. So don't feel like you have to, we have a lot of numbers on our slides, as you all know, if you've participated in one of these webinars with us before. So don't feel like you have to jot all of those down. We will have those slides available for you later. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go ahead and start with our presentation. All right, so as Hannah said, my name's Renee Fry. I'm the Executive Director of OpenSky Policy Institute, and hopefully I will be able to share my screen. Although we've been having some technical difficulty, and I am not able to rotate. So give me a minute. I apologize. Let's try this again. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, as I said, Renee Fry, Executive Director of OpenSky Policy Institute. For those of you who are new to OpenSky, we believe that the best choices are informed choices. So we work with lawmakers and other leaders to make sure that they have quality data and research to make decisions that help our communities thrive. We're nonpartisan. Our board of directors is made up of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and we focus on tax policy, budget, and education finance policy in Nebraska. So today we're going to provide some budget context and outlook. As many of you probably know, the legislature is going to be going back into session here very soon on July 20th. And so we're going to provide a little context for that, for the budget conversation that they will be having. We're going to talk some about the CARES funding that the state has received and what you can expect for those remaining days of session. So if you've seen one of our presentations before, you have seen this slide before. We always start with this slide that shows our state's discretionary spending. This is our general fund budget. This is the discretionary part of the budget. So when the legislature has to make adjustments to our budget, they typically will have to look at these areas. And you can see here that 45% of our general fund budget goes to education, 37% goes to health and human services, and then when you add public safety to the mix, that's 93% of our general fund budget goes to public safety, education, and health and human services. So again, when the legislature is in a position where they need to make cuts, they're going to look at one of those three areas. And so that's something that the legislature may be talking about again this upcoming session or next session in 2021. So we always share this slide as well, and I actually want to share it for a different reason today. What we're looking at are general fund appropriations as a share of the economy, in this case as a share of personal income. And you can see here that our spending on these main appropriations areas has declined over time. But where you see the biggest declines is during the Great Recession. And I want to flag that because, as you know, we're in a recessionary period. It is not similar to the Great Recession, but we're still very much at the beginning, and there's a lot of uncertainty that we'll talk about later about how long this may last, how what it looks like. Nebraska appears to be faring better than a lot of states, but we still don't know how long to expect this will go. And what I want to show you is this decline during the Great Recession and how long that period lasted. And actually, the legislature was really making the most significant cuts later in the recession because they had federal funding early on to really prop up the state budget. So I just think that's important context for us as we're thinking about and uncertain about how long this recessionary period may last. And again, if we really hone in on the Great Recession, we see here that the period, so the period FY09 to FY12, and there you see the biggest declines to K-12 education. You see pretty constant declines to higher education, which is that dark blue line. Health and human services, so that actually went up, which isn't really surprising that there is a greater need for services during that time. Medicaid and CHIP went down. We'll talk about that later. A lot of the reason for that isn't because needs went down. In fact, needs went up, but there was more federal funding that came in, and we have more federal funding coming in now for Medicaid as well. And so federal funds were able to offset some state funds there. And then public safety and law enforcement has been relatively flat, but kicked up in more recent years as we're dealing with this corrections issue. So in terms of our state budget, we've had budget and revenue challenges for a while. I asked Craig Beck, our fiscal analyst, to look back to see when was the last time that we actually had some money to spend going into a session. As you all know, going into 2020, legislators thought we had this projected surplus, or we had a projected surplus for this biennium of 134 million that has gone away. But the last time we had any projected surplus of any means going into a session was in 2015. So we've actually been dealing with lagging revenue for several years now. And when you think about what the budget and revenue challenges have been for us as a state, the ag economy stands out. Ag economy was actually very strong during the Great Recession, but commodity prices, trade wars, all of that has hit the ag economy harder in recent years. Then we've got flooding and disaster recovery. In fact, that will come into the budget discussion a little bit later. Then tax changes, even though our revenues have not been really rosy, we've continued to make tax changes over time. and those equated to, the Legislative Fiscal Office put a sheet together. This started with Senator Hadley was the first to request this, and tax changes passed since 2006 have reduced revenue by over 900 million in FY20 alone. So that's just something to keep in mind. Then we have other base issues, such as not taxing services. Now, one area that was fixed within the last couple of years, we weren't taxing online sales. Prior to the Wayfair decision, the legislature did implement the provisions that the Supreme Court said were constitutional. So now we are collecting sales taxes on most online sales, which actually has really helped with revenue since COVID went into effect. With more people doing their shopping online, we're still able to collect that sales tax revenue, which is, I think, really helped prop up sales tax revenue more than a lot of people thought would have happened otherwise. But we still don't tax as many services as we could, as a lot of other states do. That's one area we could look at to broaden our sales tax base. And we have a host of other exemptions that are throughout our tax code as well. We've also had revenue fluctuations due to federal tax changes. So when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed, that had implications for our state tax revenue. Now that the CARES Act has passed, that had federal tax changes that also will impact state tax revenue that we'll be talking about as well. And that has made our own state revenue a little bit more volatile. And then, of course, now we're dealing with the impact of COVID-19. So in terms of national outlook, and these next few slides are the data is compiled from several different sources. So in terms of the national outlook, the fiscal pressure on states, you have COVID costs, right? So we have outright costs for states and buying PPE and having, more staff for unemployment, that sort of thing. Also dealing with lower revenue and an increased demand for Medicaid and other state services. Moody's Analytics estimates state revenues will be reduced a minimum of 10% for states, but as much as 25% depending on the state through FY21. State shortfalls range from anywhere from, these are estimates of state shortfalls, anywhere from 325 billion is the most optimistic to 1.1 trillion. Now, these are collectively all states across the country through FY23, but pretty big numbers. The Congressional Budget Office in May revised their estimates, and they see national GDP growth being down 5.6% in 2020, up 4.2% in 2021. But again, even though it's up 4.2%, they don't expect it to be back then to 2019 levels until some point after 2021. Unemployment is expected to stay above pre-pandemic levels until 2023 or beyond. And what we're seeing nationally is that low-wage workers are bearing the brunt of the economic crisis. My guess is this is also the case in Nebraska, although we haven't seen any specific demographic data about those that are unemployed. But nationally, we're seeing younger female, Black, and Hispanic workers that are seeing a disproportionately larger share of job losses. There's a lot of disagreement as to how quickly recovery will happen. So the bottom line is that the economic impact could last longer and be larger than anticipated, with possible shortfalls lasting into FY23. There is a lot of conversation about additional federal aid. It could be tied to economic conditions in a state. So it is possible that, so in the first round, and some of the CARES Act, for example, that was distributed to states really without regard of the intensity or duration of their economic distress. That may change in future stimulus packages. in terms of Nebraska's outlook, it looks much better than the national picture. Nebraska is being hit less hard than other states, but there will be, and there are effects that are being felt here. In terms of GDP, and actually you saw that in Hannah's survey, you had, I think, 11% of nonprofits who were facing significant impact from COVID-19. So GDP is, and this comes from Dr. Thompson at UNL, and he's projecting GDP to be down 4 to 6% in FY20, and then back to, that should be back to FY19 levels by FY22. So again, we're gonna see some bounce back, but it will be a couple years before we get back to those pre-COVID levels. Some other measures of income in 2020 that he's projecting: farm income is projected to be down 22.6% in 2020. Non-farm income 0.8%, so a pretty big difference. But taxable non-farm income down further, 2.4%. Part of that would be attributed to, for example, the stimulus payments that individuals receive. That's income, but it's not taxable income. So there are, that's an important distinction for revenue purposes, that our actual income is down 0.8%, is projected to be down 0.8%, but taxable income will be down further than that. And then taxable sales down 4.3% in 2020. So you can see here, ag to be hit quite a bit harder than non-ag, and we'll look at some of the localities, and even if you look at different industries are being impacted much differently from industry to industry, much like you see nonprofits with some projecting significant losses and others not being hit quite as hard, depending on where their revenue comes from. So the Legislative Fiscal Office did a sample general fund financial status, estimating $500 million loss in the current biennium. This would assume a V-shaped recovery. So this is sort of the best case scenario, and it may be where we end up in Nebraska, but it projects a really sharp decline and then a really sharp recovery. In that V-shaped recovery scenario, our current biennial projected surplus of 138 million, I think I said 134 before, excuse me, 138 million becomes an $83.8 million shortfall. And then in the following biennium, a 431 million projected surplus becomes a $126.4 million shortfall. Again, this was just a sample of what could happen, and we'll be looking to the forecasting board on July 23rd to give the legislature some concrete numbers that they will utilize for the budget when they return. So in terms of the local outlook, from Lincoln, this is the city of Lincoln specifically. For example, in May, occupation taxes were down 53%. Sales taxes were down 14% in April. And you can see here that clothing retail was down 56% for Lincoln, but lawn and garden was up 31%. So industries are really being hit very differently. The other things that were, grocery stores were up quite a bit. Liquor stores were doing quite well. They were up quite a bit as well. So a lot of variety depending on the industry. Automobile sales were down about 10%, a little more than 10%. So not impacting folks equally. The city of Lincoln also had a lot of expenses related to COVID, protective gear and sanitizing equipment, but really the biggest impact that they're anticipating is revenue loss, because they are not able to utilize any CARES dollars for revenue replacement. We'll talk more about that later. Other localities, again, we're seeing really large swings in sales tax receipts between localities. Omaha, for example, had a 17.1% decline in April 2020 compared to 2019. Wheeler, for example, was down 80%, but La Vista was up 41.6%. So again, we're seeing not only industries that are being hit differently, but localities are as well. In terms of unemployment in Nebraska, April unemployment was 8.3%, which is the highest on record for Nebraska, although it was third lowest in the United States. May unemployment was down to 5.2% and the lowest in the country. Initial unemployment claims for March 21st through June 20th were 147,694. In comparison, 2019 total initial claims were 40,117. So again, we saw a really significant number of people that became unemployed in a very, very short period of time, and much higher numbers compared to what we normally see, and much higher numbers than what we saw in the Great Recession as well. The other thing that I would flag is that by the end of April, only 23.5% of initial claims had been paid, and we ranked 46th lowest nationally. So the national average was at 47% of initial claims had been paid, and in Nebraska, it was only 23.5%. We've paid out of the unemployment trust fund an estimated over $220 million in those 3.5 months since mid-March. And this, just for perspective, this would be more than all claims paid in 2017, 2018, and 2019 combined. So that was just over 200 million in claims in those 3 years compared to, we estimate, over 220 in the last 3.5 months. And again, it's really unclear how much of those initial claims have been paid now. We haven't seen any recent numbers, and whether that has significantly improved or whether we still have a bit of a backlog in terms of what claims need to be paid out. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that we could have 37,000 permanent job losses by 2021 in Nebraska without additional federal aid. So in terms of our financial status, and this is really specific to the legislature, it's a little bit tricky. So as you probably know, the income tax filing deadlines were extended from April to July 15th. And so it's difficult for them, and the biggest question is going to be how much income tax was shifted that was due in FY20 but was paid in FY21. So that makes the fiscal offices and the Department of Revenue's jobs a little bit harder to sort all of that out. But what the Legislative Fiscal Office would say is that we do have a $420 million cushion going into this pandemic, where we had 276 million that we were projected to be above our FY20 certified forecast. That would have automatically gone into the cash reserve. So we have 276 million. Again, it doesn't go into the cash reserve, but it's there as a cushion. And then, of course, we were projecting $134 million surplus at the end of the biennium that won't likely materialize. So that puts us at about 410 million. And if our shortfall through the biennium is 410 million or less, then it wouldn't negatively impact the budget. So according to LFO, Legislative Fiscal Office, their best guess would be that we would end the current biennium. And so the current biennium, just to clarify, we just started the second year of the biennium. So we're talking about the current biennium ending June 30th of 2021. And their best guess is that we would end up the current biennium with a $200 million shortfall. But that we could likely avert cuts if we eliminated discretionary spending that's slated, the legislature had planned. in the budget. If we use unspent funds, this is LB 1198. These were funds that the legislature appropriated to the governor to use for COVID-related expenses. If we use those unspent funds to cover 55 million in flooding expenses that the legislature still needs to pay, and then if we use year-end cash fund transfers to cover the minimum reserve, we could potentially escape any cuts this biennium. However, that would push any shortfall into the next biennium. So we would start the following biennium. That would be the budget that the legislature is going to be working on in 2021. It would push that shortfall into the next biennium. So they would start the following biennium at a deficit. So they would have to make that up then in the following biennial budget. Forecasting board meets on July 23rd. They would likely recertify the forecast downward. One positive thing that we have that will help soften any hits to the budget is that we have this enhanced FMAP, and that's for Medicaid. So additional dollars that are coming into the state that are intended to offset any increases in Medicaid needs. And that has, the federal government will continue those at least through 2020. And they were retroactive to January 1, and that's 20 million a quarter. So that would be an additional 80 million this year that will help cover Medicaid expenses.
Renee, we have a question.
Yeah.
With the delay and lag in unemployment claim processing and payment, do applicants receive retroactive dollars from the time they applied to the time they are approved?
That's a great question. And actually, that was something that we were just talking about yesterday. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's something that we're curious about as well. We don't know exactly how that works. So it's something that we're looking into. And Hannah, once we find out that answer, we'll follow back up with you and have you include that in the materials that you send out.
Thank you.
So, so in terms of the budget then, the cash reserve fund, you know, unfortunately, so essentially the legislature drew down the cash reserve to, well, let me take that back. The legislature appropriated funds for the governor to have an emergency fund for COVID, and essentially what they would do then in order to, again, soften the impact of the budget is that they could use those, the funds that he hasn't spent yet to cover the flooding expense, which would essentially then mean that we're using the cash reserve funds for the flooding, in essence, bottom line. And so they've taken the cash reserve funds down. They are below recommended levels. So the Legislative Fiscal Office would recommend going into a recession that we have 16% of our general fund receipts. In the cash reserve, we're going to be at about 7.2% going into the biennium and about 6.7% at the end of the biennium. So unfortunately, if this recession is longer or deeper, we will not have cash reserves to the level that we did going into the Great Recession. Because if you look there, going into the Great Recession, we were above that 16% thresholds, and we were able to draw down cash reserves to really help us weather that Great Recession. So unfortunately, we're starting below where we even dipped into that Great Recession. So, so the cash reserve is going to help us, I think, maybe avoid some cuts this biennium. But if this recession lasts longer, it won't be as helpful. It won't be at the level where it could be as helpful as it was in the Great Recession. So there's one other piece that has that will present itself as something the legislature needs to grapple with. the CARES Act tax changes. So we're going to talk about the CARES Act. So the CARES Act giveth and taketh away at the same time. So we're going to talk about the funding that has come to the state of Nebraska through the CARES Act, but the CARES Act also included some tax changes that, because our tax code is coupled to the federal tax code, unless we choose to decouple from the federal tax code, these tax changes will go into effect in Nebraska, and they will reduce revenue, according to the Department of Revenue, by about $250 million over the next 3 years and $125 million in FY21 alone. Although this is factored into sort of Legislative Fiscal's office, where they think we're going to be in terms of a shortfall in this biennium. So 90% of these tax cuts would be business tax cuts. And in fact, 214 million of the projected 250 million is lost revenue due to changes of how we're treating net operating losses, or NOLs is what they're called. And essentially net operating loss, and this is really complicated for me. This is a complicated issue, but essentially if you can go back and, well, if your losses, if your deductions, I'm going to get this wrong, so I'm going to come back to this. I need my little cheat sheet right now. But essentially, if you can, it's your deductions relative to your income. And if you have income losses in prior years, you can go back and essentially write off those losses. So, and what they did was the biggest change, 187.7 million of this change. So the biggest single item of all of the 10 or 12 different tax changes that were in the CARES Act. The biggest one has to do with pass-through business owners using these net operating losses to offset their non-business income, such as investment income, above previous limits. So previously they were limited to 250,000 as single, 500,000 married filing jointly, and they can go back and adjust for their prior losses. So two things that I think are important to take away when you're thinking about these CARES tax changes. One is that we're really talking about very high income earners that are able to utilize these tax changes. Only the top 1.3% of married filing jointly taxpayers in Nebraska have 500,000 or more of taxable income. So very, very high income earners that will benefit from these tax changes. And the other thing that's really important to take away is that this affects tax years prior to the pandemic. So it is retroactive to 2018 and 2019 as well as 2020. So if a business had net operating losses in 2018 or 2019, they're able to go back and amend their tax return for those years, which is why it will reduce revenue for the state of Nebraska. So what's important is that we're not talking about just those companies, those businesses or individuals who have been hit hard by the pandemic. This isn't like a targeted tax cut to really stimulate the economy and those businesses that have been impacted by COVID. This is really just, it is an accounting mechanism for really high income earners to be able to go back and adjust their net operating losses as a carryback. So again, so this is revenue loss that's in addition to any revenue losses from the pandemic. The other thing that is important is that to the extent some of these benefits, these tax cuts benefit corporations, most corporate tax cuts actually benefit non-residents because the shareholders are from across the country. And there's an argument that, again, that we should be doing these tax cuts to stimulate the economy. And if we just cut taxes in a vacuum, sure, they would stimulate the economy. But if they go hand in hand with spending cuts, and since we have to balance our budget, in the state of Nebraska. Any tax cut is usually accompanied by a spending cut or a tax increase on someone else. To the extent that they go hand in hand with tax cuts, the combination of the two actually has a negative net effect on the state economy. So again, those cuts in spending actually do more damage to the economy than tax cuts do when you do the two together. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that the CARES Act did provide a lot of financial support for businesses and individuals. Over $3 billion in PPP loans and grants that businesses and nonprofits received in Nebraska. Coronavirus relief funds, we're going to talk about that, but businesses received a really good chunk of the coronavirus relief funds, and then the economic impact payments that individuals received. So there was a lot of federal stimulus that Congress passed, and none of that impacts any state revenue. But again, we're talking about sort of blanket tax cuts that aren't targeted specifically towards businesses that are suffering during COVID, but in fact could benefit a lot of those businesses, such as groceries or gardening centers, or other entities that actually have done online retail has done quite well. So it's really not a targeted tax cut for this particular time. So while not all states conform to the federal tax code, many that do are taking action. New York decoupled from these tax changes, as well as North Carolina and Georgia. Colorado has legislation that's awaiting for a signature from their governor. Most legislatures actually aren't in session. And then a lot of the legislatures or a lot of states actually don't need to take the step of decoupling, but there are other states that have opted in one way or the other to say, we don't want these tax cuts at the state level, and have adopted legislation to reflect that. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the CARES funding that has come into the state. So again, we've received billions in federal stimulus dollars from the federal government, $125 billion in coronavirus relief funds for Nebraska and Douglas County. We'll talk about that a little bit more specifically. $151 million for education, $62 million for transportation, plus another $65 million for airport grants, $4 million for election security. Then there's been a lot of additional funding for disaster relief, public health, loans for states, cities, and businesses, and of course the Paycheck Protection Program. There's a lot of media around Nebraska in particular really took advantage and had one of the highest application rates in the country, and received about $3.4 billion in PPP loans. So specifically, the governor's plan for the coronavirus relief funds. So the reason I wanted to focus on this a little bit is because this $1.25 billion was discretionary, whereas everything else that I laid out on the prior slide, other than the coronavirus relief fund, was for a very specific purpose, and there wasn't any discretion around it. So the governor basically said, here is how we are going to use our $1.084 billion in these relief funds, with $166 million going to the Douglas County for them to decide how to use their allotment. So the governor opted to give $180 million to state and local governments. And again, this can only be used for expenses related to COVID or issues related, it had to be COVID specific. So for example, the governor could have given, if he wanted to, individual payments to anyone who is at risk of being evicted from their home or from their apartment. So it could have been used for individual payments. Some states have opted to do that, but it had to be some sort of COVID-related event. It cannot be used for state and local governments, at least at this time, to just backfill revenue. State and local governments, 180 million. So that again, in the case of Lincoln, the city of Lincoln, for example, and the sales tax shortfall that they're seeing, they can't go back and fill revenue, but they could use it for any additional costs for their Department of Public Health or PPP that they're buying for their city staff or cleaning supplies, anything like that, they can use it for. Then the governor set aside $330 million for stabilization grants for small businesses and livestock producers, $40 million for rural broadband, $16 million for workforce retraining, and $1 million for Gallup Back to Business Learning. I think that there's about $5 million for administrative support to business programs, but I'm not completely sure. That was in his initial outline. I haven't seen anything about that lately. He did also set aside $427 million to use that to refill the unemployment insurance trust fund, or if Congress decides, okay, we're going to let you use your coronavirus relief fund to backfill revenue at some later time. He set that aside for that purpose as well. But the latest that I'm hearing is it's unlikely, or it's looking less likely, I should say, that Congress changes the CARES Act so that that funding can be used to backfill revenue. More likely that they will do a separate stimulus bill. But again, that's still up in the air. That's still being discussed. So Anne, if you want to join here and talk about the coronavirus relief funds and what the governor set aside for nonprofits.
So the governor for nonprofits, Nan's been working, we wrote the governor to really express the need in nonprofits. So many of our members and those of you on this call, you're really first responders. We've had lots of conversations with Department of Economic Development trying to be eligible for some of that $392 million that was given to businesses, but we're not successful. The governor has set aside a total of $85 million for nonprofits. The stabilization grants, those are up to $12,000 per organization. This morning we found out they were supposed to be due, but the deadline's been extended to July 10th at noon. So you have until Friday. And so those are for any 501c3 organizations and specific organizations that are on the Department of Health and Human Services website. These grants are all being administered by DHHS. So that's one of the grants. There are the response and recovery grants. And just a clarification, when you go to DHH's website, they will list these first two both under that area, so you want to read carefully on that. These are for nonprofits and providers that help out children, families, communities to apply for funds that they need, and those will range for anywhere between $50,000 and $2 million in operations. The deadline for that is July 8th, and so that's the deadline for that. So that's tomorrow. And then there are the Healthy Place grants, and this is for cleaning, protection gear, those types of things. There's $2 million available. There's smaller amounts. It's up to $250 for home child care, or $500 for child care centers, but to help reimburse you for some of those costs of keeping on top of it and keeping things clean and healthy. I will just add quickly, and we'll send this when we send out the links, the State Chamber, they also did a statewide survey of the economic impact of COVID on all businesses, including nonprofits. We worked with the College of Business down at UNL, and they did a special report and extrapolated the data just for nonprofits. 692 organizations were nonprofits that participated in that, so you'll get that information. And then we'll also send you the link. Nebraska Children's and Families Foundation has done a really nice job in creating a matrix on what resources are out there for all nonprofits. So we will get you that information. And I think it's back to you, Renee.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Really quick, it did look like we had a question about, I'm gonna go back one slide, maybe, or not.
I can answer or ask you the question, Renee.
Yeah, and my There we go. Okay. So, so the question was about whether local governments were eligible for the CRF funds if they required if masks were required in government buildings. And as far as we know, it's still the case that if a local government requires patrons to wear masks, they would not be eligible for those funds. My understanding is that provision did not change. So those local governments cannot require Nebraska residents to wear masks, or if they do, they are not eligible for those funds. So our final section of the presentation is what to expect for the remaining days of session. According to the speaker, the chamber is going to look and function differently to account for COVID. You might have seen some of the pictures of the legislature where they have the plexiglass up, the dividers. They still intend to at least get priority bills heard, but there's no guarantee of passage. And he has indicated that any proposal with an appropriations bill attached, anything that costs money, will be difficult to pass. He has asked senators that have bills with a fiscal impact to go back and minimize their costs. As he said, it doesn't make sense to spend money we don't have. He's indicated that any new subject areas, such as police reform, will not be allowed to be amended onto existing bills unless they've had a public hearing. I will tell you, I'm not sure whether there are plans to have new bills introduced on this subject. I would anticipate there would be a lot of conversation around police reform on other bills that may not necessarily be germane, but I do expect that this topic will really dominate the session, at least on the mic. And so there was this gang of 10 that was put together to try to come up with a compromise on tax incentives and property taxes and the UNMC Next project. And at this point, they have not been able to come up with any compromise. So the speaker is still hoping that incentives and property taxes can move together. And they each have a priority designation so that they can move forward on their own if the body chooses to do that. LB 1034 is sort of if there isn't any agreement on tax incentives, LB 720, that is, there is another bill, LB 1034, that would extend Nebraska Advantage for 1 year. The speaker has indicated, at least right now, that it doesn't look like that would necessarily move forward. And there has been some question about whether the governor had the ability to distribute the coronavirus relief funds that we talked about just a minute ago. And the speaker believes that the governor that was within his authority to do so. So that is just a summary of some comments that the speaker has made. So in terms of the topics for when the session reconvenes on July 20th, obviously they'll need to come back and work on the biennial budget. And the biennial budget is actually passed for the biennium. So they don't need to make any other changes, but certainly oftentimes in a short session, they'll come back and make modifications to the budget. That still is sitting out there. And I think there is some interest to still tweak the biennial budget, but honestly, they could just not reconvene and be done for the session and not need to do anything further. But I think there probably is some interest to at least come back and make some tweaks to the biennial budget as it stands today. As I mentioned, there was some question about whether the governor could distribute CARES Act funding. I'm not sure if that will come up in the remaining days of session, but it could possibly. As I mentioned, I think racial equity will dominate the session, at least on the mic. I don't know what that looks like in terms of bills yet, but there will be a lot of conversation. There will be, I think, a lot of conversation about COVID priorities. So more funding for public health, for example, whether we need to make adjustments or changes to unemployment. You may have seen that the governor has indicated that many of the steps he took at the beginning of the pandemic, where he said, okay, if you're unemployed, you don't need to look for work. He is he signed an executive order requiring people to look for work once again. So does the legislature agree with that decision? That could possibly be something that they talk about, or whether, unemployment, the number of weeks that people qualify for unemployment, whether that needs to be extended. That could be a subject of conversation. Medicaid expansion certainly is supposed to take effect on October 1, and whether any changes to what the governor has planned could come up. And then SNAP food benefits, and whether there are changes that are needed there while people are going through this public health and other crisis right now, where it's been very apparent that a lot of folks don't have access to food, and whether SNAP provisions should be changed so that those benefits are extended to a greater number of people. In terms of the property tax incentive UNMC next debate, currently the property tax vehicle is LB 1106. There was a ballot initiative that would have changed how we do property taxes a little bit with the refundable income tax credit, and that initiative was suspended. So now it remains to be seen as to what happens with LB 1106. LB 720 is the tax incentive bill that would replace Nebraska Advantage. Nebraska Advantage does sunset at the end of this year. And then the UNMC project is the third piece of this tripod that they're trying to move forward. And this is a very big $300 million obligation for the state of Nebraska that would really enhance the state's biomedical responses, such as what we're dealing with now, and build a new hospital and some other things.
We have a couple questions from there.
Okay, sure.
One is, what about childcare and rental relief?
I haven't heard, I think maybe on childcare rental relief. I think it sort of depends on how much rental relief is addressed through the coronavirus relief funds. I have not heard any specific legislation on that, or if there's anything that was still there from last year. So I wouldn't say no, it's not something that I've heard sort of at the top of the list that's being discussed. But I think, again, some of that may be dependent on some of those coronavirus relief funds. And I know that the philanthropic community is put a lot of money into housing issues. And again, I think some of that depends, what are the remaining issues? Is there more funding, or do the laws need to be changed so that people aren't evicted? But that's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. So it very well may be a top issue, but it's not something that I have heard a lot about, but maybe specific to the issues that we work on.
We have another one, and I think it might be the same kind of thing, but I'll ask to see. Are child advocacy centers and CPS organizations being considered under the umbrella of COVID priority in terms of securing resources to make sure children and individuals are safe and getting the support they need? Yeah,
so I should clarify that, my PowerPoint. These are the issues that I've really heard other advocacy organizations talking about as priorities. I think everything that has been lifted up, I mean, there are a whole host of issues. And so maybe I should clarify my statement. I will clarify my statement a little bit. There are lots of needs, and I think the pandemic has really lifted up where our safety net has holes in it. Where we will be limited was a statement that I made about the speaker earlier, and that, again, there needs to be some sort of existing legislation. So those topics that I mentioned as likely being priority, there is an existing piece of legislation out there that could be brought up to deal with some of those safety net issues. So I apologize, I did not intend to at all say that those were the only priorities, but in a 17-day session, the legislatures and a 17-day session with the introducing period having passed in January, right, last January, I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the legislature trying to figure out, okay, these are the bills that are sitting out there that could be used to address safety net issues right now. And then I think next January, you're going to see a much more robust conversation about all the safety net issues. That we're just operating in a very short session and really limited because we're limited by a couple of things. We're limited by A bills, right? So for example, SNAP is 100% funded at the federal level. And it's a 50-50 split in the administration. So increasing SNAP benefits to Nebraska residents could be done at a very, very low cost to the state of Nebraska. And there is a bill that is sitting, that is available, that could be used to do that. So I didn't mean to indicate that there aren't a whole host of other priorities, but in a 17-day session, they're really going to be limited to things that don't cost very much money and things that already have an existing vehicle. So I apologize for the way I characterize that. So in terms of, I should have provided that context, I guess, for my comments. In terms of the property tax discussion, this is one where we still, when we talk to senators about property tax, about reducing property taxes, while we understand, we have seen the trends and talked again about farm income being down significantly. So we have a lot of empathy on this issue, but we don't have state revenue. And so we're still a little bit perplexed as to where money to reduce property taxes would come from. And so that's something that we're really grappling with is, okay, yeah, that sounds great to provide property tax relief to Nebraska residents, but how do we pay for that? And again, what are those trade-offs? What are we going to cut in order to provide property tax relief? I won't go into depth on LB 1106. I've talked about it before. It was previously LB 974. It's very similar. There are only a couple of minor changes, but it is intended to be new state aid for schools, but it does come at the expense of funding for schools all the time. So I think what I'll just leave you with is what's underlined and bolded at the bottom is that all school districts oppose LB 1106. So even though it is more funding for schools, and more state aid for schools, it is less funding for each individual districts because they will lose funding over time. So they're very concerned, if you think about it right now, as schools are trying to figure out how they're going to educate their students in this new world, where ideally you would actually be more spread apart and have fewer bodies and seats. So, you know, every other seat is full rather than every seat, and then have to do all of this with less funding on top of it becomes pretty concerning. The other thing that we're concerned about is, again, we're talking about property taxes. Let's let schools focus on COVID and how they're going to educate their students rather than adding this, adding a discussion about state aid on top of what they're already dealing with in the middle of this pandemic. If we want to talk about property tax relief, let's take the schools out of the equation, let them do their job right now, and not, because this is a major overhaul to how we fund K-12 education, and to do that in the middle of a pandemic does seem to add more to their plate than maybe they need right now. There are alternative ideas, such as putting more money into the property tax credit program, or increasing funding for special education, or some mechanism outside of TIOS, outside of our K-12 funding formula, that ensures rural schools receive new state aid. Think that there's some possibilities there, as long as it doesn't negatively impact those schools that are receiving state aid right now. Tax incentives are another really big issue, and I won't go too much in depth, but we have had tax incentives since 1987, started with LB 775, followed by Nebraska Advantage with LB 312 in 2005. Now the legislation that's being discussed is LB 720. These incentives in Nebraska at least have lacked any but-for requirements. You don't, so essentially, if you meet certain employment and you meet certain investment, then you receive these dollars. And it doesn't have to be, so if you're a new business and you're planning on creating that many employees and doing that level of investment, you don't need to show that you're only doing it because of these incentives. Even if it was part of your business plan, you would anyway, and you were planning to do it with or without the incentives anyway, you would get those funds. These programs, and I'll show you, have extended for a very, very long time. We continue to pay out on LB 775. Again, that's been around since 1987, although it is finally starting to taper off. And it's contributed to some revenue volatility in the state. And it's reduced our revenue since 1987 by $4 billion. And even after you account for economic gain, and these are numbers from the Department of Revenue, LB 775 has resulted in a net revenue loss of $2 billion, or will result in a net revenue loss of $2 billion by 2025. And Nebraska Advantage, a net revenue loss of $1.5 billion by 2028. And again, those are numbers from the tax incentive report by the Department of Revenue. So LB 720 is similar to LB 775 and Nebraska Advantage, although it is intended to ramp up faster, which does mean it will reduce state revenue faster. The most recent amendment does have some annual caps, but the Attorney General has indicated that there are some constitutionality issues with the way that was written. It would reduce $992 million through FY31. And it doesn't, Nebraska Advantage would sunset, but again, we would continue to pay out on that, and I can show you what that looks like. It does have a lower wage threshold than last year's bill. In certain industries and areas, the threshold is lower, which means a family of four would be eligible for SNAP and free lunch and Medicaid expansion at those income levels. So we do question having jobs that are incentivized that actually require, that are low enough wage jobs that they're eligible for other government programs like SNAP and free lunch and Medicaid expansion. If the idea is that we want to incentivize high wage, high quality jobs, then our wage threshold should be higher. Does require health care benefits are offered, but it doesn't require that they're paid. So again, if we want high quality jobs, we would suggest actually raising the threshold of these. It allows pooling of part-time positions, which had previously been removed. And then there's a $40 million retention incentive for one company. Whoever applies first, they would get this credit for staying in the state. If they could say they would move without this credit, they would be able to receive $40 million over a 10-year period. If you look at our combined, if LB 720 were to pass, our estimated tax incentive liability through 2028 is $2.24 billion. And you can see Nebraska Advantage is actually the majority of that, because that continues on the books. Nebraska Advantage and 775 don't go away if 720 passes. So we just add a third program onto these two existing programs. And just to put this in numbers, it's about $2,600 per Nebraska household, just for a little bit of context for you. You can see here too, you can see the blue bars are LB 775. That program was costing between $100 and $150 million per year for reduced revenue by that amount for several years. And we added Nebraska Advantage. You can see the spikes here. once you have those two programs. And then the dotted yellow line is LB 720. And so you can see here that again, we were at about 100 to 150 million. We had Nebraska Advantage, those numbers increase. And then when you add LB 720, while you're continuing to pay out for Nebraska Advantage, then our average is at that $250 million level. So much higher than it had been when we had just LB 775. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, if LB 720 didn't pass this year, senators do have a bill that they could use to extend Nebraska Advantage for a year if they wanted to. And I think this is a really important point for us to consider right now. If LB 720 passes, 2020 will be the base year for calculating full-time equivalents for incentive purposes. Okay, so a company would have an incentive to lay employees off this year so that their base year is lower, and then add employees back on in 2021 that they would have hired anyway. So they'll essentially get more incentives the lower their full-time equivalents are in 2020. So we would really encourage the legislature, if they move forward with 720, that at least they make their base year prior to February of 2020, so that these depressed FTE numbers don't result in higher incentives and certainly don't result in companies being incentivized to actually reduce their full-time equivalents during this pandemic. The University Next project I mentioned, 300 million, about 50 million a year starting in FY22 or FY23. It had been the plan to amend that on to LB 720. I think that's still the case, although we'll have to see what happens when they come back. And just would note that if LB 720, LB 1084 and 974, my apologies, that should be 1106 now. It changed from 974. Essentially, if the tax incentive bill, the university bill, and the property tax bill all pass, they would collectively reduce about 7 to 9% of general fund revenue a year. So we're talking about a really big commitment that the state would be making when there's a lot of uncertainty as to how our revenue is going to be looking down the road. So that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. I think we have time for questions, Hannah. Is there any more?
We don't have any questions in the queue right now. If anyone does have a question after this or think of one, I'd be happy to relay it on to Renee.
Looks like we have a raised hand. I don't know if we're...
Yeah, I can let her talk, Renee. I can let the person talk if you want.
Okay, yeah, it's Val.
Okay.
Let's see what he's got.
Val, you are on. So you'd have to, I'll unmute you too. All right, Val, you should be able to talk.
Actually, Renee, I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm going to assume I'm going to say thank you for a lot of people who are on this call and are really impressed with the research that you've done, and would certainly like to wish you the very best in terms of what I know you're going to need to do in this upcoming session.
Well, Val, I really appreciate that. And of course, we have a fantastic team at OpenSky, and just folks who are really dedicated and believe in the work that we do. They work really, really hard, and they're really, really smart, much smarter than I am. So, so thank you so much. And it's validating, I think, for all of us to hear that that work is appreciated. We know it's important, and so we really appreciate your response, Val. Hannah, we can't hear you.
You'd think I would have this down by now. Okay, that's all I have, and we don't have any more questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this joint presentation, Hannah. I really appreciate NAM and appreciate our partnership. And I think we said slides will go out We'll follow up on that unemployment insurance question. That was something we had on our list to dig into as well. And I think if you get any other questions, well, hopefully when you get your slides, our emails are at the end. Feel free to shoot us an email if there's anything else that folks think about, but otherwise, I think we'll give everyone 15 minutes back of their day.
Thank you so much, Renee and OpenSky team. We, again, really appreciate your partnership and your expertise in this area. Thank you.
Thank you.